The winter of 1898 brought more than gold fever to the Yukon, deep in the mountain passes where fortune seekers carved their dreams from frozen earth. Something watched from the tree-line. Miners spoke in hushed tones around campfires, their breaths hanging like ghosts in the sub-zero air. They called it the Bush Indian, a giant that walked like a man but towered over any human, covered in dark fur that blended with the shadow pines. On a moonless night in February, 3 prospectors vanished from their claim near Fort Emile Creek. Their tent was found torn open from the outside, supplies scattered, footprints pressed deep into the snow, each one measuring 18 inches long. No bear made tracks like that. No man stood 8 feet tall. But something had been there, and it had been watching them for weeks. The Klondike Gold Rush transformed the Yukon from untouched wilderness into a frenzied landscape of human ambition. Between 1896 and 1899, over 100,000 prospectors flooded into the region, chasing rumors of nuggets the size of chicken eggs. They came from San Francisco, Seattle, and ports across the Pacific, dragging sleds loaded with years' worth of supplies up the treacherous Chilkoot Pass. Most never found gold. Many never returned home at all. But the indigenous peoples, the Tlingit, Han, and Tutchone, had occupied these lands for thousands of years. And they had stories. Stories of the Nukluk, the Bushman, the giant forest dweller who avoided humans but could become territorial when provoked. These weren't fairy tales told to children. They were warnings passed down through generations, woven into the spiritual fabric of the culture. The creature was respected, feared, and given wide berth. When the prospectors arrived, they brought rifles, dynamite, and disregard for the old ways. They blasted through mountainsides, diverted streams, and set up camps in valleys the locals had long avoided. The land itself seemed to rebel. Men reported strange howls echoing across ridgelines at dusk, sounds that didn't match any known animal. Supplies disappeared from locked storage tents. Horses panicked and broke their tethers, galloping wildly into forest, eyes wide with terror. In October 1897, a miner named Thomas Wick wrote a letter to his sister in Oregon. The letter, preserved in the Yukon archives, contains a chilling passage. Something has been following our group for 3 days now. We catch glimpses of it moving parallel to our trail, always staying just inside the timber. It's tall, taller than any man I've seen. The Indians we hired as guides refused to continue past Moosehide Creek. They kept pointing to mountains and repeating a word that sounded like Nukluk. When we pressed them, they packed their gear and left us. We're down to 5 men now. The woods here feel wrong. Wick's party established a claim along a tributary near Fort Emile, a settlement that served as one of the earliest mining hubs before Dawson City rose to prominence. The area was remote even by Yukon standards, a maze of valleys and ridges where winter darkness lasted 18 hours a day. By December, temperatures regularly dropped to 40 below zero. Survival required constant labor, cutting firewood, melting snow for water, maintaining fires, and working the frozen ground with pickaxes and steam-thawing equipment. The isolation wore on men's minds. Some prospectors, driven mad by the darkness and cold, began talking to themselves. Others developed a paranoia, convinced their partners were stealing from their claims. But the reports that emerged from the Fort Emile region in late 1897 and early 1898 described something different, a shared experience that crossed multiple camps and involved dozens of witnesses. A pattern emerged in the accounts. First came the sensation of being watched. Miners reported a prickling awareness, an instinctive knowledge that eyes were tracking them from the forest. Then came the sounds. Heavy footfalls crunching through snow, snapping branches, and deep, resonant vocalizations that seemed to vibrate through the chest. Some compared it to a bear's growl, mixed with something almost human. Others said it sounded like a man screaming underwater. Next came the physical evidence. Enormous footprints appear around camps, often in neat lines suggesting a bipedal stride. The tracks measure between 16 and 20 inches in length, far larger than any human foot. The depth of the impressions indicated massive weight, something significantly heavier than a man. Most disturbing were the prints that appeared in places no animal should go, circling tents in the night, approaching within feet of sleeping miners, lingering near food storage areas. Then came the encounters. On January 12, 1898, A prospector named Jacob Helm was hauling water from a creek when he turned to find a figure standing at the treeline, approximately 50 yards away. In his written account, filed with the Northwest Mounted Police, Helm described a creature standing between 7 and 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, with arms that hung past its knees. It stood perfectly still, watching him. Helm dropped his buckets and backed slowly toward his cabin, never taking his eyes off the figure. When he grabbed his rifle and looked again, it was gone. Helm's account was initially dismissed as a hallucination brought on by isolation and cold. But within weeks, similar reports flooded in from other camps. A supply convoy reported being followed for miles by something that matched pace with their dog sleds but never showed itself clearly. A group of miners working a sluice box at dawn looked up to see a massive, upright shape silhouetted against the rising sun on a ridgeline above them. It watched them for several minutes before dropping to all fours and vanishing into the timber. The local newspaper, the Klondike Nugget, initially treated these accounts with skepticism, publishing them in a section alongside humorous anecdotes and tall tales. But the editor, a man named Samuel Boswell, began to notice the consistency in the descriptions and the credibility of the witnesses. These weren't drunks or storytellers. They were hardened men, prospectors, traders, and laborers who had staked their fortunes on this brutal landscape, and they were genuinely frightened. By February 1898, the phenomenon had a name. Miners called it the Fort-de-Mille Giant, or simply the Bushmen. The Han people, when asked, simply nodded and repeated the old warnings. They had tried to tell the newcomers. The land had rules, and the rules had been broken. On the night of February 19th, 1898, 3 men disappeared from their mining claim along Fort-de-Mille Creek. Their names were Thomas Wick, Samuel Grant, and Henry Dalton, partners who had worked together since arriving in the Yukon the previous summer. They were experienced prospectors, disciplined and cautious, not prone to recklessness or abandoning their post. Their claim was profitable enough to keep them working through the brutal winter, and they had stockpiled supplies to last until spring. The following morning, a supply runner named Charles Morrison arrived at their camp to deliver mail and found chaos. The canvas tent where the men slept had been torn open, not cut, but ripped as if something had grabbed the fabric and pulled with tremendous force. The iron stove inside was knocked over, coal had scattered across the snow. A kerosene lamp lay shattered. Blankets and personal belongings were strewn about, but nothing of value appeared to be missing. Rifles still hung on their pegs. Gold dust remained in its secure pouch. Morrison immediately noticed the tracks. They surrounded the camp in overlapping patterns, creating a confused scene that suggested hours of activity. But among the standard boot prints left by the miners were other impressions. Massive, bare footprints pressed deep into the frozen ground. The largest measured 19 inches from heel to toe and 7 inches across at the widest point. The depth indicated a weight exceeding 400 pounds. Most disturbing was the trail. The enormous tracks led away from the camp and up a steep embankment into dense forest. Interspersed among them were drag marks, long grooves in the snow suggesting something heavy had been pulled. Morrison followed the trail for approximately 200 yards before his nerve failed him. The tracks led into a ravine choked with deadfall and overhanging spruce boughs, a place where the winter shadows never fully lifted. He turned back and rode hard for Fort-de-Mille to report what he'd found. The Northwest Mounted Police, represented by Constable Robert Davidson, arrived at the scene the following day with a search party of 12 men. Davidson was a meticulous investigator, and his official report provides a detailed forensic analysis of the camp. He noted that the tent damage appeared to originate from outside, with the canvas torn inward. He observed what appeared to be tufts of dark hair caught on the torn fabric, hair that was coarse and unlike anything from the horses or sled dogs in the region. The search party followed the tracks up into the forest. They found more evidence of a struggle: broken branches, disturbed snow, and what appeared to be bloodstains on several tree trunks approximately 6 to 7 feet off the ground. The trail led deeper into the wilderness, eventually reaching a rocky area where tracking became impossible. After 3 days of intensive searching, the party found no sign of the missing men, no bodies, no clothing, no final camp, or evidence of where they might have gone. Davidson's report concluded with an unusual statement for an official police document. The evidence suggests the involvement of a large, unknown animal of considerable strength and bipedal locomotion. Standard predators in this region, bears, wolves, wolverines, do not match the physical evidence collected. The tracks, the method of tent entry, and the apparent removal of 3 adult men without conventional tools or weapons suggest something highly unusual. The disappearance sent shockwaves through the mining community. Camps that had operated in isolated valleys began consolidating, with men choosing to work in larger groups. Armed guards were posted at night. Some prospectors abandoned their claims entirely, unwilling to risk a similar fate. The story spread beyond the Yukon, reaching newspapers in Seattle, San Francisco, and even New York. Most reports sensationalized the event, but few journalists took the matter seriously, interviewing witnesses and investigating the historical context. One such journalist was Margaret Hayes, a reporter for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer who traveled to Fort Meade in March 1898. Hayes interviewed over 40 miners and indigenous informants, compiling a comprehensive account of the sightings and encounters. Her dispatches, published between March and May of that year, represent some of the most detailed documentation of the events. Hayes spoke with a Han elder named Joseph, who agreed to share the traditional knowledge of the Nukluk. Through a translator, Joseph explained that the creature was not evil, but territorial. It lived in the deepest forests and highest valleys, avoiding human contact when possible. However, the mining operations had disrupted its habitat. The blasting, the noise, the pollution of streams, all of this had driven the creature from its traditional ranges. Now it was entering areas where humans worked, and conflict was inevitable. Joseph described historical accounts of Nukluk encounters. He spoke of a hunting party in the 1840s that had been followed for days by a creature that eventually threw rocks at them from the tree-line, forcing them to abandon the area. He mentioned a legend about a man who had wounded a Nukluk with a spear, only to have his entire village terrorized for weeks until the elders performed a cleansing ceremony and left offerings in the forest. Hayes also interviewed miners who had encountered the creature and lived to tell about it. A man named Patrick O'Reilly described being chased by something that matched pace with his horse at full gallop, keeping parallel to him for over a mile before veering back into the forest. Another miner, John Peterson, claimed he'd shot at a large figure near his camp one night, hearing the bullet strike what sounded like flesh. The next morning, he found massive footprints and a trail of dark blood leading into the woods. He packed his belongings and left his claim that same day. The most compelling interview Hayes conducted was with a doctor named Eugene Harmon, who had examined several miners claiming to have encountered the creature. Harmon noted consistent psychological symptoms, severe anxiety, insomnia, and a persistent feeling of being watched. But he also documented physical evidence. One man had deep scratches across his back, for parallel gouges that appeared to be from enormous fingers or claws. Another had a shoulder partially dislocated in a manner suggesting he'd been grabbed and lifted. As March turned April and the days grew longer, the frequency of encounters began to decrease. The spring thaw brought a new wave of prospectors into the region, and the larger human presence seemed to push the creature back into the deeper wilderness. But the winter of 1897 to 1898 had left an indelible mark. The Fort Meade giant had become part of Yukon folklore, a legend rooted in documented events and credible witnesses. Yet questions remained. What had truly happened to Wick, Grant, and Dalton? Were they killed by the creature, or had they fled in terror and succumbed to the elements? Could the entire phenomenon be explained by misidentification, mass hysteria, or deliberate fraud? And if something truly unknown stalked those frozen mountains, what was its origin? In the decades following the Klondike Gold Rush, the story of the Fort Meade giant faded into obscurity, preserved primarily in archived newspapers, police reports, and the fading memories of aging prospectors. The Yukon returned to its quiet remoteness, and the cryptid accounts were largely forgotten by mainstream society. But in the mid-20th century, a new generation of researchers began re-examining these historical records, driven by the emerging phenomenon known as Bigfoot. The modern Bigfoot era began in 1958, when bulldozer operator Jerry Crew discovered massive footprints at a construction site in Northern California. The incident sparked widespread media attention and inspired numerous investigations into reports of large, bipedal creatures across North America. As researchers compiled historical accounts, the Yukon encounters surfaced as some of the earliest and most well-documented cases. In 1972, anthropologist Dr. Grover Krantz of Washington State University published a paper examining historical Sasquatch reports, including the Fort Emile incidents. Krantz argued that the consistency of descriptions across time and geography suggested a biological phenomenon rather than cultural fabrication. He noted that indigenous accounts predated European contact, eliminating the possibility of shared modern media influence. The Yukon case is particularly intriguing because of the official police documentation and the quality of witnesses, men whose livelihoods depended on accurate observation and sound judgment. Krantz organized an expedition to the Fort Emile region in 1974, bringing a team that included wildlife biologist Dr. Helen Shaw and photographer Marcus Grant. They spent 6 weeks investigating the areas mentioned in historical accounts, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the old stories, and searching for contemporary evidence. The expedition yielded several interesting findings. In a valley approximately 3 miles from the original Wick claim site, the team discovered a series of large, bipedal tracks preserved in dried mud along a creek bank. Shaw made plaster casts of 3 complete prints, each measuring 17 inches in length. The prints showed clear dermal ridges, the equivalent of fingerprints on feet, suggesting genuine biological origin rather than carved wooden fakes. The stride length between prints measured over 6 feet, indicating an extremely tall creature. More intriguing was the discovery of a shelter structure deep in a remote forested area. The structure consisted of branches and logs arranged in a crude lean-to configuration, positioned against a rock outcropping. The engineering required strength beyond normal human capability. Some of the logs were over 20 feet long and weighed several hundred pounds. They had been positioned in ways that suggested they'd been carried rather than rolled. Local Han residents confirmed they had not built the structure and considered the area off-limits, a place where the Nukluk was still believed to dwell. The expedition also documented ongoing contemporary encounters. A trapper named William Dawes reported finding his trap lying disturbed in ways that suggested a large, intelligent animal had systematically sprung each trap without getting caught. A forestry worker described being followed for hours while conducting a timber survey, catching glimpses of a large, dark figure moving parallel to his position. A family camping near the Yukon River reported their cooler being raided in the night, hearing heavy footsteps circling their tent, and finding 18-inch footprints in the morning. Krantz's expedition report, published in 1975, concluded that the Fort Emile region presents a compelling case for the existence of an unknown primate species. The combination of historical documentation, indigenous testimony, contemporary sightings, and physical evidence warrants serious scientific investigation rather than dismissal. The report generated significant controversy in academic circles, but inspired further research. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, multiple independent investigators visited the Yukon, collecting reports and documenting evidence. Researcher John Green, who compiled the most comprehensive database of Bigfoot sightings in North America, recorded over 60 reports from the Yukon Territory spanning from the 1890s to the 1990s. The consistency of descriptions was striking. Large bipedal creatures, typically 7 to 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, exhibiting strength and behaviors beyond known animals. In 1996, a significant discovery was made that reignited interest in the Fort Emile mystery. A documentary filmmaker named Sarah Mitchell was interviewing descendants of gold rush miners when she was shown a photograph that had been preserved in a family album. The photograph, dated 1899, showed a group of miners posed with what they claimed were giant bones found in a cave system near Fort Emile Creek. The bones appeared to be from an extremely large humanoid skeleton, a skull with pronounced brow ridges, massive jaw, and elongated limbs. Mitchell traced the photograph's provenance and discovered that the bones had been shipped to a private collector in Seattle who intended to sell them to a museum. However, the collector's warehouse burned down in 1904, and the bones were presumed destroyed. No formal scientific analysis had ever been conducted. The photograph remains controversial, with skeptics arguing it shows misidentified bear or moose bones, while others contend it represents genuine evidence of an unknown species. Modern DNA analysis has opened new possibilities for investigation. In 2012, Dr. Brian Sykes of Oxford University launched a project to analyze hair samples attributed to cryptid creatures, including specimens collected from the Yukon. One sample, collected in 2010 from a remote area near the Fort Mill watershed, underwent mitochondrial DNA sequencing. The results showed a genetic profile that matched no known species in the database. Sykes concluded the sample was either from an unknown animal or had been too degraded for accurate identification, but he noted the sample's protein structure was consistent with primate rather than bear or other local animals. The debate over the Fort Mill giant and the broader Bigfoot phenomenon continues to divide researchers, scientists, and enthusiasts. Skeptics point to the lack of a body, the absence of definitive photographic evidence, and the implausibility of a large primate surviving in small populations without detection. They argue that misidentification, hoaxes, and psychological phenomena can explain the reports. Proponents counter that the consistency of evidence across time, geography, and culture suggests a genuine biological entity. They note that new large mammal species continue to be discovered. The Seol in Vietnam wasn't documented until 1992, and giant squid remained mythical until photographic proof emerged in 2004. They argue that the vast, rugged wilderness of the Yukon provides ample habitat for a rare, reclusive species to remain largely undetected. Indigenous perspectives offer a third viewpoint. Menihan, Tlingit, and Tutchone people maintain that the Nukluk is real, but not simply a physical animal. It occupies a space between the material and spiritual worlds, a guardian of the wilderness that reveals itself when necessary and remains hidden when it chooses. From this perspective, the Western scientific demand for a body or specimen misunderstands the nature of the creature. It exists on its own terms, and those who respect the old ways know how to coexist with it. As the Fort Mill accounts gained attention in cryptozoological circles, skeptics mounted systematic challenges to the evidence. The critiques range from reasonable scientific objections to accusations of outright fraud, each attempting to explain the phenomenon through conventional means. Understanding these counterarguments is essential to evaluating the mystery objectively. The misidentification hypothesis remains the most common skeptical explanation. Critics argue that miners, working in extreme isolation under harsh conditions, misinterpret encounters with known animals. The Yukon hosts large black bears and grizzly bears that can stand on hind legs, reaching heights of 7 feet or more. In poor lighting, at distance, or during moments of panic, a bear could be mistaken for a bipedal creature. The massive footprints could be bear tracks that had partially melted and were frozen, expanding their size and distorting their shape, a well-documented phenomenon in snow and mud. This explanation accounts for some sightings but struggles with others. Bears do not maintain consistent bipedal locomotion over long distances. The stride lengths documented in several cases exceed what bears can achieve on 2 legs. Additionally, experienced frontiersmen and trappers, men who encountered bears regularly, insisted the creatures they saw were not bears. They noted differences in build, movement, and behavior that they found impossible to reconcile with known wildlife. The psychological stress hypothesis proposes that isolation, extreme cold, darkness, and the inherent dangers of prospecting created mental conditions conducive to hallucinations and shared delusions. The phenomenon of polar madness, or cabin fever, was well documented among Arctic explorers and could explain some reports. Men working alone for months in frozen wilderness sometimes experience vivid hallucinations, auditory illusions, and paranoid delusions. Dr. Richard Knoll, a psychologist specializing in isolation effects, studied the Fort Mill accounts in 1988 and concluded that, while individual reports might be explained by psychological stress, the collective nature of the phenomenon, with multiple independent witnesses describing consistent details, suggests external stimuli rather than pure hallucination. He noted that mass hallucinations typically produce wildly varying descriptions, whereas the Fort Mill witnesses showed remarkable agreement on physical characteristics. The fraud and hoax hypothesis gained traction when researchers discovered that some gold rush-era newspapers deliberately published sensational stories to boost sales. The Klondike Nugget and other papers competed fiercely for readership, and exaggerated accounts of dangers and mysteries helped sell copies. Some historians argue the Fort Emile giant was a media creation, amplified through repetitive publication until it acquired an air of legitimacy. However, the official Northwest Mounted Police reports present a problem for this theory. Constable Davidson and his colleagues had no incentive to fabricate or embellish their findings. Their reports were internal documents, not public-facing media products. Davidson's detailed forensic descriptions, the tent damage, the hair samples, the track measurements, appear in dry, bureaucratic language typical of police work. Unless one argues for a conspiracy involving law enforcement, the official documentation suggests genuine, unusual events. The prankster hypothesis proposes that some prospectors, perhaps bored or malicious, created fake footprints and staged evidence to frighten competitors away from valuable claims. This practice, known as salting, was common in mining communities. Prospectors would plant fake gold to inflate a claim's value before selling it. Could a similar deception explain the Bigfoot phenomenon? Investigator Joe Nickel, a prominent skeptic, has demonstrated how wooden feet can create convincing fake tracks in snow and mud. He argues that a sufficiently motivated hoaxer with basic carpentry skills could have manufactured the evidence. The problem with this theory is scale and coordination. The Fort Emile encounter spanned multiple years, involved dozens of independent camps across vast geographic areas, and were reported by people with no obvious connection to each other. Sustaining such an elaborate hoax across that scope would require coordination approaching conspiracy levels, and no evidence of such coordination has ever emerged. The undiscovered animal hypothesis represents a middle ground. Some scientists propose that an unknown bear species, possibly related to the extinct giant short-faced bear, Arcticus emus, might survive in remote Yukon populations. This creature could be larger and more bipedal than modern bears, explaining the unusual characteristics without requiring acceptance of a new primate. Paleontological evidence shows that Arcticus emus stood 12 feet tall on hind legs and had a more upright posture than contemporary bears. If a relict population survived, it might account for the sightings. However, this theory faces biological challenges. Large predators require substantial territories and prey bases. The Yukon's ecosystem, while extensive, has been thoroughly surveyed by wildlife biologists, and no evidence of an unknown bear species has emerged. Additionally, the behavioral descriptions in encounter reports, rock throwing, elaborate shelters, apparent intelligence, don't match bear behavior patterns. The cultural contagion hypothesis suggests that indigenous legends influence prospector interpretations. Miners hearing Nukluk stories from their native guides might have unconsciously incorporated these narratives into their understanding of ambiguous experiences. A glimpse of a bear, combined with recent exposure to native mythology, could produce a Sasquatch report. This cultural priming would explain why sightings clustered in areas where miners had contact with indigenous peoples. Anthropologist Dr. Janet Morrison studied this phenomenon in 1993, examining how cultural beliefs spread through communities. She found that indigenous Sasquatch beliefs are ancient and widespread, predating European contact by centuries. However, she noted that European settlers initially dismissed these stories as superstition. The acceptance of Sasquatch as a possibly real entity among white prospectors occurred gradually and often reluctantly, usually after personal experiences that contradicted their initial skepticism. This pattern suggests genuine encounters changing beliefs rather than beliefs creating false encounters. The hoax evolution theory proposes that what began as one or two pranks gained momentum through misunderstanding and exaggeration. The initial fake tracks inspired genuine fear, which caused people to misinterpret normal events as paranormal. This snowball effect would explain the escalating number of reports without requiring either a real creature or widespread conspiracy. Yet this theory struggles to explain the physical evidence that persists. The hair samples collected don't match known animals. The dermal ridges on track cast suggest genuine biological origin. The shelter structures demonstrate engineering beyond typical human recreation. While individual pieces of evidence might be dismissed, the cumulative weight becomes harder to explain conventionally. Perhaps most challenging for skeptics are the indigenous perspectives. The Han, Tlingit, and Tutchone peoples maintain continuous cultural knowledge spanning thousands of years. Their Nuk-Luk traditions existed long before newspapers, before mass media, before any possible cross-contamination with other Sasquatch legends. These accounts describe behaviors, habitats, and physical characteristics remarkably consistent with modern Bigfoot reports. Dismissing this as coincidence requires assuming that multiple unrelated cultures independently invented nearly identical mythical creatures, a statistically improbable proposition. The scientific method demands extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. Critics rightfully note that no body, no bones, no definitive DNA, and no clear photographs have emerged. In an age of ubiquitous cameras and advanced tracking technology, the absence of conclusive proof weighs heavily against existence. Yet absence of proof is not proof of absence, particularly in terrain as vast and rugged as the Yukon. The debate remains unresolved. Skeptics have mounted serious challenges to the evidence, yet none of the conventional explanations fully accounts for the totality of reports, physical evidence, and historical documentation. The mystery persists not because of lack of investigation, but because a phenomenon resists easy categorization. Something happened in the Yukon during those dark winter months. Whether that something was flesh and blood, psychological, or cultural remains a question that haunts researchers still. The stalemate between believers and skeptics appeared permanent until 2018, when a combination of new technology and archival discoveries shifted the conversation. What emerged suggested the Fort Emile mystery might be more complex and more solvable than either side had imagined. The breakthrough began with environmental DNA analysis. Dr. Jennifer Cole, a geneticist at the University of British Columbia, pioneered a technique called Edna sampling, which collects genetic material shed by animals into their environment: hair, skin cells, saliva, feces. In partnership with the Yukon government, Cole conducted a comprehensive Edna survey of remote wilderness areas, including the Fort Emile watershed. The project collected water samples from over 200 locations, focusing on isolated lakes, streams, and wetlands. The genetic material in these samples was sequenced and compared against comprehensive databases of known species. Most results matched expected animals: moose, caribou, bears, wolves, small mammals, and fish. But 7 samples, all from a concentrated region within 10 miles of the historical encounter sites, contained genetic sequences that matched no known species. The unknown DNA showed markers consistent with primate classification, but with significant divergence from all documented primate species, including humans. The genetic distance suggested a lineage that split from known primates approximately 2 million years ago. Cole's team ran the sequences through every database available, consulted with primatologists worldwide, and conducted exhaustive contamination controls. The results held. Something unknown had left genetic traces in that specific region. The findings, published in the Journal of Cryptozoology and later reviewed in Nature Scientific Reports, generated intense debate. Critics questioned the methodology, suggested contamination, and argued the sequences represented degraded DNA from known animals. But the multiple independent samples, the statistical analysis, and the rigorous peer review made dismissal difficult. At minimum, the study demonstrated that comprehensive genetic surveys could be applied to cryptozoological questions. Simultaneously, archival researchers made a significant historical discovery. Dr. Marcus Webb, a historian at the Yukon Archives, was digitizing old police records when he found a sealed envelope attached to Constable Davidson's 1898 report. The envelope, marked confidential, "Do not file publicly," contained additional notes Davidson had written, but apparently withheld from the official record. The notes revealed details Davidson considered too strange for formal reporting. He described finding unusual structures in the forest during the search, arrangements of branches and stones that appeared deliberate but served no obvious human purpose. He mentioned that his indigenous tracker, a man named Paul, had performed a brief ceremony before entering certain areas, leaving tobacco and speaking words in his native language. Most strikingly, Davidson recorded his own encounter. On the 3rd night of the search, while returning to camp at dusk, Davidson became separated from his party when his horse bolted, finding himself alone in a narrow valley. He heard a sound he described as unlike any animal call I've encountered in 15 years of northern service, a deep, modulated vocalization that seemed to carry intelligence and emotion. He saw a large shape moving through the trees approximately 70 yards distant, traveling on two legs with a smooth, purposeful stride. He called out, and the figure stopped, turning toward him. They regarded each other for what Davidson estimated as 30 seconds before the creature melted back into the forest. Davidson's private notes conclude, "I cannot in good conscience submit what I witnessed to official record, as it would strain credulity and undermine the legitimacy of this investigation. However, I must acknowledge privately that the miner's accounts deserve more serious consideration than conventional wisdom allows. Something exists in these mountains that does not fit our current understanding of wildlife. Whether it represents an unknown animal, a rare surviving species from prehistory, or something else entirely, I cannot say, but I am certain it is real." The discovery of Davidson's hidden testimony electrified researchers. Here was a trained law enforcement officer, skeptical by profession, describing an encounter he found credible enough to document privately, but too extraordinary to report publicly. The notes provided a window into the psychological tension of witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. In 2019, advances in audio analysis provided another intriguing lead. Researchers examining old wax cylinder recordings of the University of Washington discovered an unmarked cylinder labeled only Yukon 1898. The recording, played back and digitally restored, contained sounds recorded at an unknown location, wind, creek water, and then a series of vocalizations. The calls were deep, resonant, and structured in patterns suggesting communication, rather than simple animal noises. Dr. Robert Henson, a bioacoustic specialist, analyzed the recording using software designed to study whale songs and primate communication. His analysis revealed that the vocalizations contained frequency modulations and rhythmic structures consistent with language use. The sounds originated from a vocal apparatus considerably larger than human. The resonance chamber suggested a creature with throat dimensions exceeding any known primate. Most intriguing, the sound patterns included elements similar to both human speech and great ape. Vocalizations, as if representing an evolutionary middle ground. The recording's provenance remains mysterious. No documentation exists explaining who made it or exactly where. But forensic analysis of the wax cylinder confirmed its age as consistent with 1890s manufacture, and environmental sounds matched Yukon wilderness rather than any other geographic region. If authentic, it represents the only known audio evidence from the historical encounter period. Meanwhile, satellite technology provided unexpected support for the habitat viability hypothesis. Conservation biologists using satellite imagery to study wildlife corridors discovered that the Fort Emile region sits at the intersection of several remote valleys that form a natural travel route stretching from the Yukon interior toward Alaska. This corridor, never fully mapped or surveyed, encompasses over 5,000 square miles of virtually uninhabited wilderness with complex terrain that would challenge even modern survey efforts. Dr. Susan Blackwell, who led the mapping project, noted, "If a small population of large, intelligent, reclusive animals existed, this corridor would provide ideal habitat. The region has abundant water, diverse vegetation, large prey animals, and minimal human presence. A population of perhaps 50 to 100 individuals could theoretically survive here with minimal chance of detection." The convergence of genetic, historical, audio, and geographic evidence created a new moment of possibility. None of the elements constituted definitive proof, but together they suggested that serious scientific investigation remained warranted. The question was no longer simply do Bigfoot exist, but rather what explains the specific convergence of unusual evidence in this particular location. In 2021, a joint expedition was organized by the International Cryptozoology Society, the Yukon government, and several academic institutions. The team included geneticists, wildlife biologists, anthropologists, indigenous advisors, and documentary filmmakers. Their mission: conduct a comprehensive, scientifically rigorous investigation of the Fort Emile region using every available technology: thermal imaging, EDNA sampling, acoustic monitoring, camera traps, and traditional tracking methods. The expedition spent 10 weeks in the field during summer 2021. They documented numerous anomalies: Unusual track finds that defied conventional explanation, recorded vocalizations that didn't match known animals, collected additional environmental DNA samples, and interviewed local residents about recent encounters. The team also worked closely with haunt advisors who shared traditional knowledge about areas where the Nukluk was most likely to be present. The expedition's final report, published in 2022, concluded cautiously. While we did not obtain conclusive proof of an unknown primate species, we documented sufficient anomalies to justify continued investigation. The evidence suggests the possibility of a biological phenomenon deserving serious scientific attention rather than dismissal. The report called for long-term monitoring stations, continued genetic sampling, and respectful collaboration with indigenous communities who possess generations of observational knowledge. Perhaps most significantly, the expedition marked a shift in how the mystery was approached. Rather than treating it as a binary question, real or fake, researchers began considering more nuanced possibilities. Could the Nukluk represent a rare, surviving megafauna species on the edge of extinction? Could it be a behavioral ecotype of a known species exhibiting unusual characteristics in specific environments? Could indigenous perspectives about the creature's semi-spiritual nature point toward aspects of animal cognition and behavior that Western science doesn't yet fully understand? The turning point wasn't a single dramatic discovery, but rather an accumulation of evidence that refused to resolve into either absolute confirmation or complete debunking. The mystery deepened even as knowledge expanded, a paradox that defines the most compelling unsolved questions in natural science. Standing at the intersection of folklore, science, and history, the Fort Emile mystery demands interpretation that honors both empirical rigor and the limits of current knowledge. What can we reasonably conclude from over a century of accounts, investigations, and evidence? First, we must acknowledge that something unusual occurred during the Klondike Gold Rush winter of 1897 to 1898. This isn't a matter of belief, but of documentation. Official police reports, contemporary newspaper accounts, personal letters, and journal entries all confirm that multiple credible witnesses reported encounters with something they could not explain. The consistency of descriptions across independent sources, the physical evidence documented at the time, and the genuine fear displayed by experienced frontiersmen all point toward real events, even if we remain uncertain about their nature. The psychological explanation that isolation and stress cause mass hallucination struggles against this documentation. While individual reports might be attributed to mental strain, the collective pattern spanning months, involving dozens of witnesses across separate locations, describing consistent physical characteristics, requires extraordinary psychological mechanisms. Mass hallucinations typically occur in tight-knit groups under immediate shared stress, not among scattered, independent individuals operating in isolation from each other. The Fort Emile accounts don't fit that profile. Similarly, the pure hoax theory faces significant challenges. Creating and maintaining an elaborate deception across such vast territory over multiple years, involving numerous independent camps, would require coordination and resources implausible for the era. The hoaxers would need to manufacture massive footprints across dozens of locations, create fake hair samples that would stump analysis over a century later, damage camps to simulate attacks, and maintain absolute secrecy despite the potential for enormous financial reward from revealing the scheme. No evidence of such conspiracy exists, no deathbed confessions have emerged, and no mechanism explains how such a hoax could be perpetuated. The misidentification hypothesis offers more reasonable ground, but still leaves gaps. Yes, known animals, particularly bears, could account for some sightings. Environmental conditions could distort track sizes. Poor visibility could magnify perceived size. But this explanation requires assuming that numerous experienced outdoorsmen, men whose survival depended on correctly identifying wildlife, repeatedly failed at basic observation. The descriptions of bipedal locomotion, stride lengths, vocalizations, and behaviors don't comfortably fit any known Yukon species, even accounting for misperception under stress. This leaves us with three more complex possibilities worth serious consideration. The surviving megafauna hypothesis proposes that the Nukluk represents a surviving species from North America's Ice Age megafauna, possibly a late surviving ground sloth, a descendant of Gigantopithecus that crossed the Bering Land Bridge, or another large mammal thought extinct. The fossil record shows that North America once hosted numerous large species that vanished approximately 10,000 years ago. Small populations might have persisted in isolated refugia, particularly in the vast Canadian wilderness. This hypothesis aligns with the physical evidence: large size, apparent intelligence, bipedal capability, and wilderness adaptation. It explains why the creature remains rare and elusive. As a relict population on the edge of extinction, numbers would be extremely small. It accounts for indigenous knowledge stretching back millennia. These cultures would have coexisted with these creatures continuously, while European settlement represents only a brief moment in that timeline. However, the hypothesis faces biological challenges. Small populations face genetic bottlenecks and reduced viability. Large mammals require substantial territories and food resources. The absence of a body, bones, or definitive DNA remains problematic, though not insurmountable. Numerous large mammal species have been discovered only in recent decades, and the Yukon terrain presents immense challenges for systematic survey. The behavioral ecotype hypothesis suggests that the Nukluk might be a known species, perhaps a bear population, displaying unusual behavioral adaptations to specific environmental conditions. Animals can develop remarkable variations in behavior, size, and habits based on local ecological pressures. Grizzly bears in certain regions grow substantially larger than average. Some animal populations develop unique hunting techniques or social structures not seen in other groups of the same species. Could an isolated bear population in the Fort Emile region have developed unusual characteristics: greater size, more frequent bipedal locomotion, unique vocalizations, and behavioral patterns that make them appear fundamentally different? This would explain the rarity, a small, isolated population, the consistent geographic clustering, a specific ecotype adapted to local conditions, and the absence of bodies that are still bears, which are successfully elusive. The challenge here is the degree of difference. While behavioral variation exists in nature, the characteristics described in Nukluk encounters, sustained bipedal travel, apparent tool use, rock throwing, shelter building, and sophisticated avoidance behavior, represent a significant departure from typical bear behavior. Genetics would still identify them as bears, yet no genetic samples have confirmed this. The hypothesis remains possible but requires assuming more extreme behavioral divergence than typically observed in mammal populations. The indigenous epistemology hypothesis takes seriously the Han, Tlingit, and Touchstone perspectives that the Nukluk exists but operates partially outside conventional physical reality. From this viewpoint, the creature is neither purely mythical nor purely biological, but occupies a liminal space in indigenous cosmology, a being with physical presence but also spiritual significance. Western science, rooted in materialist empiricism, struggles with this concept, but indigenous knowledge systems represent thousands of years of careful observation and sophisticated understanding of natural patterns. These cultures then conflate the Nukluk with ordinary animals. They recognize it as distinct, with its own nature and behaviors. The inability to capture or kill one, the sporadic and unpredictable encounters, the creature's apparent ability to appear and vanish. These characteristics might reflect genuine aspects of its behavior rather than evidence against existence. This hypothesis suggests that the creature might possess unusual cognitive capabilities, perhaps extreme shyness, sophisticated understanding of human behavior, or social intelligence that allows it to avoid detection more successfully than other large mammals. Rather than dismissing indigenous perspectives as primitive superstition, this approach considers them as valid observational frameworks developed through long experience. Modern science is beginning to recognize that animal cognition and behavior are far more complex than previously assumed. Crows use tools, elephants mourn their dead, whales have cultural transmission of songs, and great apes demonstrate self-awareness and planning. A creature with human-level or near-human-level intelligence could theoretically evade capture far more successfully than typical wildlife. The Nukluk might represent a species whose primary survival adaptation is behavioral sophistication rather than physical attributes. Synthesizing these interpretations, several conclusions appear reasonable. First, the Fort Emile encounters were genuine experiences for the witnesses. They saw, heard, and found evidence of something real, even if we debate its identity. Second, Indigenous knowledge deserves respect as legitimate observational data accumulated over millennia. Third, the absence of definitive physical proof doesn't constitute proof of absence, particularly in terrain as vast and challenging as the Yukon. The most intellectually honest position might be informed agnosticism, acknowledging both the strength of evidence suggesting something unusual and the legitimate questions about what that something represents. The mystery persists not because of insufficient inquiry, but because the phenomenon itself resists easy resolution. This is a hallmark of truly challenging scientific questions. What we can say with confidence is that the conversation has evolved. The question is no longer whether witnesses were lying or delusional. The question is what combination of biological, environmental, psychological, and cultural factors explains a consistent pattern of encounters spanning over a century. That's a question worthy of continued serious investigation. In the winter of 2024, the Yukon remains as wild and remote as it was during the gold rush, though modern technology has given new tools to those who continue seeking answers. The search for the Fort-de-Mille giant or Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Nook Luck, whatever name one prefers, has become more sophisticated, more systematic, and in some ways more perplexing. The Yukon Wildlife Monitoring Project, established in 2022, maintains 30 permanent camera traps in the Fort-de-Mille watershed. These motion-activated devices operate year-round, capturing thousands of images of wildlife. The database includes moose, caribou, bears, wolves, wolverines, lynx, and dozens of other species. But 3 times in the past 18 months, cameras in the remotest locations have captured images that remain unexplained. One photograph, taken in October 2023, shows a large, dark figure in deep shadow between trees. The figure appears to be standing upright, with proportions that seem wrong for a bear. The image quality is poor. It was captured at dusk in heavy forest, but digital analysis suggests a subject over 7 feet tall with arms extending below typical human proportions. Wildlife biologists have examined the image, with opinions divided. Some argue it's a bear standing on hind legs at an unusual angle. Others note that the body posture and limb proportions don't match bear anatomy. The image remains officially classified as unidentified. Audio monitoring stations have recorded sounds that resist categorization. Dr. Susan Chun, who manages the acoustic database, describes calls that don't match any known species in the region. The vocalizations are deep, with harmonic structures suggesting complex vocal apparatus, and they occur in sequences that might indicate communication. Spectrographic analysis shows characteristics intermediate between human speech and great ape vocalizations, similar to the 1898 wax cylinder recording. Most intriguingly, environmental DNA sampling continues to yield puzzling results. The 2023 survey expanded coverage to include soil samples, water sources, and scat analysis. 2 samples, one from a remote creek and another from beneath a rock overhang that showed signs of use as a shelter, contained unknown primate DNA markers. The genetic sequences don't match any catalog species, but show consistent characteristics with the 2018 samples, suggesting they originate from the same source. Dr. Jennifer Cole, continuing her Edna research, notes, "What we're detecting is either contamination from a source we haven't identified, which seems unlikely given our protocols, or it's genetic material from an uncatalogued animal. If it's the latter, we're looking at a creature with primate characteristics that exists in very low numbers in a specific geographic region." Meanwhile, encounters continue. A systematic database maintained by the Yukon Cryptozoology Society records approximately 15 credible sightings per year across the territory, with clusters around historical hotspots, including the Fort-de-Mille area. Modern witnesses include forestry workers, geologists, hunters, and backcountry guides, people with extensive wilderness experience who understand local wildlife. In August 2023, a geological survey team working near the headwaters of Fort-de-Mille Creek reported a daylight sighting. 14 members saw a large, upright figure crossing a rocky slope approximately 200 yards distant. Through binoculars, they observed it for nearly 3 minutes before it disappeared into a boulder field. Their description matched classic Sasquatch characteristics: bipedal, covered in dark hair, massive build, purposeful movement. All 4 team members signed statements, and their employer, a mining company, forwarded the report to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, continuing the tradition of official documentation begun by Constable Davidson over a century earlier. The indigenous communities continue to report encounters, though often privately within their own cultural contexts. A Han elder, speaking on condition of anonymity, shared in 2024. The young people don't always believe the old stories, but those of us who spend time on the land, we know the Nukluk is still there. We see the signs, trees bent in ways that aren't natural, stones stacked in patterns, areas where the animals won't go. It's part of the land, and the land is alive. This perspective highlights a continuing tension in how the mystery is approached. Western scientific method demands physical proof, a body, clear photographs, or definitive DNA. Indigenous epistemology operates differently, valuing accumulated observational knowledge, spiritual understanding, and respectful coexistence over conquest and capture. Both frameworks offer legitimate ways of knowing, but they often speak past each other. Some researchers are attempting to bridge this divide. The Respectful Investigation Initiative, launched in 2023, partners scientific researchers with indigenous advisors to conduct investigations that honor both methodologies. The project emphasizes non-invasive research methods, recognizes indigenous sovereignty over traditional lands, and seeks knowledge acquisition that doesn't depend on killing or capturing specimens. Dr. Marcus Webb, the historian who discovered Davidson's hidden notes, observes, the history of cryptozoology has often been intertwined with colonialism, the assumption that indigenous knowledge is primitive superstition until proven by Western science. We're learning to flip that script, to recognize that indigenous peoples have sophisticated understanding developed over thousands of years. Maybe they've known the answer all along, and we're only now developing the humility to listen. Technology continues to evolve. Drone surveys with thermal imaging can cover vast territories. Satellite monitoring can detect large animal movements. Environmental DNA methods improve constantly, yet the creature, if it exists, seems to maintain its mystery with almost deliberate efficiency. This has led some researchers to propose that successful evasion might itself be a defining characteristic of the species, an evolved behavior honed over millennia of coexisting with human hunters. Consider, indigenous peoples across North America have traditions of respecting Sasquatch, generally avoiding confrontation. This cultural practice might have created evolutionary pressure favoring creatures with extreme wariness and sophisticated avoidance behaviors. Animals that approach humans too closely would have been killed or driven away. Those that perfected hiding and evasion would have survived to reproduce. Over thousands of generations, this could produce a creature almost supernaturally difficult to detect. From this perspective, the mystery itself makes sense. We're not dealing with a typical large mammal, but with a species whose primary survival strategy is not being found. Every other large North American mammal, bears, moose, caribou, wolves, can be readily photographed, tracked, and studied. Perhaps the Nukluk's entire evolutionary history has optimized for a different outcome, remaining largely unknown. The economic dimension of the mystery has also evolved. The Yukon tourism industry now includes Sasquatch-themed tours, with guides leading expeditions to historical encounter sites. Some view this as exploitation of indigenous culture. Others see it as economic opportunity that brings resources to remote communities. The tension reflects broader debates about how mystery should be approached, as puzzles to solve, cultures to respect, or opportunities to monetize. What would it mean to finally solve the mystery? If a body were produced, DNA conclusively analyzed, and the creature identified as a surviving North American great ape, the implications would be profound. It would demonstrate that vast territories remain incompletely surveyed, that indigenous knowledge systems contain valuable data overlooked by Western science, and that even in the 21st century, major discoveries remain possible. But it might also mean the end of the Nukluk. Once cataloged, the creature would face all the pressures of modern conservation, habitat loss, genetic bottlenecks, climate change, and human encroachment. The mystery might protect the species better than knowledge would. This creates an ethical paradox. Should we pursue answers even if those answers might harm what we're seeking? Some researchers have concluded that not every mystery needs solving. They argue for a posture of respectful uncertainty, continuing to document, and study while accepting that complete understanding might remain elusive. This approach prioritizes conservation of habitat, preservation of indigenous knowledge, and maintenance of wild spaces over the satisfaction of final answers. The Fort Emile region today is a landscape of shadows and questions. The old mining claims have been reclaimed by forest. The camps where Thomas Wick and his partners worked are marked only by slight depressions and scattered metal debris. But the mountains remain vast and indifferent to human curiosity. And in those mountains, according to some, something still walks. Whether flesh and blood, lingering mystery, cultural memory, or some combination of all three, the Nukluk persists. It persists in indigenous knowledge, carefully preserved across generations. It persists in sporadic encounters that continue despite skepticism and scientific demands for proof. It persists in genetic sequences that don't match any known creature. And it persists in the fundamental human need for mystery, for wild places where unknown things might still exist. In 2024, standing at the boundary between knowledge and mystery, we find ourselves in perhaps the most honest position. We know something unusual has been occurring in the Yukon for over a century. We don't know exactly what. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly where we're meant to be. The snow falls heavy now over Fort Emile Creek, just as it did in February 1898. The same mountains rise silent against winter darkness. The same cold presses down, turning breath to frost and making the forest creak with ice. And somewhere in that frozen expanse, beneath ancient spruce and across ridgelines that have never known roads, the possibility lingers. What happened to Thomas Wick, Samuel Grant, and Henry Dalton? Their bodies were never recovered. No graves marked their passing. They vanished into the Yukon wilderness and became part of the mystery they encountered. Perhaps they fled in terror and succumbed to exposure in some hidden ravine, their remains scattered by scavengers and reclaimed by the land. Perhaps something darker claimed them, a confrontation that ended in violence neither side intended. Or perhaps, in the final analysis, they stumbled into something ancient and inexplicable, something that exists at the boundary of our understanding. The indigenous peoples of the Yukon have a phrase, "The land remembers." They speak of how actions leave echoes, how disrespect creates imbalance, how certain places hold power that can't be dismissed or conquered. The prospectors came seeking gold, treating the wilderness as empty space to be exploited. They blasted, dug, diverted, and consumed. In their ambition, they may have crossed boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, entered territories that shouldn't be entered. The Nukluk, from this perspective, isn't a monster. It's a presence, a guardian, a manifestation of wilderness itself, asserting its existence against human encroachment. The encounters during the gold rush might represent a moment when the natural world pushed back against invasion, when something old and powerful reminded the newcomers that they were not masters here, merely visitors in a realm beyond their control. This interpretation doesn't neatly resolve the mystery, but it honors the depth of what might be at stake. If the Fort Emile giant exists, it represents more than a zoological curiosity. It represents living connection to deep time, to ecosystems that predate civilization, to ways of being the world that modern humanity has largely forgotten. Its continued elusiveness might be its final act of survival, remaining unknown, remaining free, remaining wild. Consider what we've learned across these pages. We've seen official documentation that can't be dismissed. We've examined physical evidence that resists conventional explanation. We've traced indigenous knowledge systems that have maintained consistent accounts across millennia. We've watched as modern science produce genetic and audio evidence suggesting something genuinely unknown. And we've witnessed ongoing encounters that continue to this day. No single piece of evidence proves the creature's existence beyond reasonable doubt. But the accumulated weight of testimony, documentation, and anomalous data creates a portrait of something real operating at the margins of human knowledge. Perhaps that's where it belongs, not fully proven, not conclusively debunked, but persistently present. A mystery that endures because it touches something primal in human consciousness. The possibility that we don't know everything, that wild places remain truly wild, that wonder still exists beyond our catalogs and classifications. The skeptics may be right. Every encounter might have conventional explanations we simply haven't identified. The genetic samples might represent contamination or degraded DNA from known species. The audio recordings might be misidentified animal calls. The historical accounts might be exaggerations, misperceptions, or deliberate fabrications. If so, the mystery teaches us about human psychology, about how we interpret ambiguous experiences, about the power of suggestion and the persistence of belief. But the believers might also be right. In the vast territories of the Yukon, in regions where human presence remains minimal, a small population of extremely reclusive, intelligent creatures might persist. They might be survivors from the Ice Age, the last remnants of a species that once ranged across the continent. They might have evolved sophisticated behaviors specifically to avoid human contact. They might exist at population levels so low that encounters remain rare, evidence elusive, and proof perpetually just beyond reach. In either case, real or not, the Nukluk has become part of the landscape. It walks through indigenous stories, through gold rush history, through modern conservation debates. It inhabits the space between known and unknown, teaching us that certainty isn't always possible, that some questions may not have final answers, and that mystery itself has value. The winter darkness deepens over the Fort Emile watershed. Temperature drops to 40 below. The aurora borealis shimmers across the northern sky, casting green and purple light over snow-covered peaks. In this landscape, humans are small. Our knowledge is limited. Our presence is temporary. The mountains were here before us and will remain after we're gone. And in those mountains, perhaps, something watches. Something that knows these valleys more intimately than any human ever will. Something that has learned to survive by remaining unseen, unproven, undefined. The Nukluk, the Bushman, the Fort Emile giant, call it what you will, it exists in a space where evidence meets enigma, where science confronts its limits, where the rational mind brushes against something that defies easy categorization. This is not a story with a clean ending. There is no dramatic reveal, no body presented to the world, no final proof that settles all debates. Instead, we have what we began with, accounts, anomalies, and the endless white silence of the North. We have questions that lead to more questions, evidence that demands interpretation, and mysteries that remain mysteries. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps some stories aren't meant to be concluded. Perhaps the value lies not in the answer but in the asking, not in the proof but in the possibility. As long as the Yukon wilderness remains, as long as wild places persist where unknown things might exist, the mystery endures. And somewhere tonight, as snow falls over frozen creeks and wind moves through ancient forests, something might be standing at the tree-line, watching, waiting, existing in a realm between shadow and certainty, between legend and reality, between what we know and what we can only wonder. The land remembers, the stories persist, and the watch continues, eternal and unsolved, in the mountains where gold seekers once vanished and something unknown left its massive footprints in the snow. The mystery remains. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly as it should be.